There is something sinister about the coastline of the British Isles, which stretches for some 7,000 miles. It's home to grand hotels and picturesque promenades. On the surface, there are bright lights and funfairs, sandy beaches and beautiful sunsets. But dig a little deeper in the sand and you uncover an underworld of murder and mayhem. In Coastal Killers, we take a journey to the cliff's edge, where the land meets the sea and life meets death. A shoreline that is awash with tales of death and depravity. These are the chilling true stories of Britain's worst coastal killers.
We're in Torquay today, where in 1974 its job centre was the scene of a horrible massacre. But could it all have really been due to one man's insecurity about his height?
A lot of people, like myself, kind of associate Torquay with Agatha Christie, so in that sense it's got this kind of criminal association already, but you imagine it is about fiction, not about fact. And Torquay's had this reputation as kind of this genteel seaside town, you know, kind of the English Riviera, genteel holiday makers visiting it, but at the same time, as with lots of kind of otherwise innocuous towns across Britain, it's got this darker side. It's got this kind of element of danger in terms of drifters, people coming into the town, trying to find some sort of sense of their life, struggling to maintain themselves. So there's always this kind of darker underbelly to a lot of places. But if you look at kind of other spree killings, other kind of hard to understand massacres, sort of Dunblane, Hungerford, you know, these take place again in communities that you would think were absolutely fine and safe and not where trouble happens. So you can never predict, particularly with these kind of crimes, where something is going to happen. It can happen anywhere.
There was an interesting thing about Torquay in the early 70s. We were moving in from the sort of quite optimistic 60s and moving into the sort of the more disillusioned 1970s. And there was two particular incidents that really transformed the town. The first in 1973 was some 4 killings in a local casino. But within 12 months, there was another major incident, and I think those two incidents that came from opposite ends of the social and economic system really transformed and almost demolished Torquay's self-image as somewhere that was discreet, sedate, very elite in the sort of tourist pantheon. There's apocryphal stories that went around at the time, and I remember them quite clearly, that Torquay had the highest murder rate in Europe for about 12 months. And it really shook people, and it really challenged that image that the tourist board and the tourist industry were trying to put out. But it really exposed, first of all, with the casino killings, that potential level of corruption. But on the other side, that we had an underclass of people who were excluded from society that lived in some of the sort of worst accommodation in the entire southwest, in sort of bedsit land, and where it happened in the job centre that there were relatively large numbers of public staff that were just completely undefended and just not expecting this kind of assault.
1974 was a grim year in Britain. The country was in the grip of rampant inflation. A miners' strike had led the government to impose a 3-day working week, and above all, unemployment was rising and was a significant problem. Around 1 million people, that's 4% of the adult working population, were unemployed. One of those people on the dole was a 31-year-old man called Michael Anthony Brown. And he lived in a shabby, one-roomed flat in Torquay.
Michael Anthony Brown was from a pretty prominent family who lived in Ipswich. He was educated at a grammar school. He did pretty well in life. He gained 5 O-levels and seemed to have the world at his feet. But he left home pretty shortly after leaving school, and he ended up relocating to Torquay. But he never really got into a job that he wanted. He always seemed to kind of fall short of the things that he wanted in life.
We measure our self-esteem, and other people measure us by what we do. If we're in a high-powered job, a professional, then people are going to give you a different status than if you're in a low status job. I mean, if you're unfairly, I think, a dustman or a cleaner or something like that, people are going to look at you differently than if you're a professor or you're a doctor or you're a bank manager or something like that. In both examples, you could be nice, good, honest people, but society will treat you differently.
Michael Brown had been at one stage in his young life a carpenter. He'd worked as an office clerk, but he was now one of the long-term unemployed. And he was deeply resentful of this, what he saw as a humiliating position. And he wrote letter after letter, complaint after complaint, to the local employment exchange, as job centres were called back then in Torquay. And there was a constant theme within his complaints. He believed he was being discriminated against, and he argued, he believed passionately that he was the victim of societal prejudice. And that prejudice wasn't, in his mind, about his colour or his religion or his race or his sexuality. Michael Brown was obsessed with the belief that he was being discriminated against because he was short.
From what we know about Michael Brown, he seems to be a somewhat angry man and somewhat slightly paranoid about the world and thinking the world is against him. Time and time again, there's stories he's written, poetry he's written, shows quite clearly that he feels the world is against him. And the reason the world's against him is because of his height. Apparently he was only 4'6", so he was short by any standards. And I think he didn't get the respect that he thought he was due. He got a few O-levels from school, he thought he was quite bright, he thought he could do better than what he actually did in life, and he felt, or certainly this is the impression he gave, that the world treated him badly.
He also was known to have quite an artistic temperament. He liked to write. Neighbours would often say they could hear his typewriter long into the evenings. And he wrote poetry. He was very expressive with words. And in his poetry, he would talk about prejudice and how he felt that people were looking down at him, mainly because of his size. He was partially disabled, and at 31, he only stood at 4'6". So he felt that people would use his size as a way to demean him.
He came to believe that this was the reason he couldn't get work. And he came to have what was almost a paranoia about this, a complex developed in his mind that he was being laughed at because he was so short. And it was that developing mental health problem which would lead him to commit mass murder.
This is one of those cases that's really difficult to understand, partly because the perpetrator isn't here to tell us why he did what he did, and didn't leave behind any kind of clear reason why he killed these people. And so in that sense, it's quite hard to understand. You can't empathise with him because you don't know what his reasoning was. And these were people who were complete strangers to him. So there's no relationship between them that you can try and investigate or understand. This is simply a man who had some kind of grudge against society, against the world, and just targeted random people to try and make himself feel better. Michael Brown is an individual who's struggling to be heard. You strongly get the sense that he needed someone to talk to, he needed companionship or friendship, and he didn't have that. So the picture you get is of this loner who's sitting on his own in his accommodation, struggling with his feelings of anger, of resentment, of uselessness in a way. He hasn't got a purpose in life. And so the only way that he can express himself at home is by writing poems where he sets out that he feels that he's a victim of prejudice, where he can actually explore his feelings. Obviously, given what happens, that isn't enough of an outlet for him. He's still got this kind of frustration that he can't express to anyone, that he hasn't got friends to tell what's happening to him. He hasn't got counsellors who could help him. So all he's got is this poetry and this shotgun.
He'd spent an awful lot of time writing to the job centre, but Michael also kind of felt that he wanted to speak to some of the managers. He the week before, gone in and asked for a manager called John. So wherever he kind of went, he felt that people were just putting blocks up to stop him. And he was very well known to the job centre staff. They all knew of him, but none of them really noticed him in the way that he wanted to be noticed, as somebody that was competent and could do what they were doing.
Intelligent man, grammar school boy, 5 GCEs, very good qualifications, should certainly have been in good employment, certainly but a loner, and probably consumed by self-doubts, not helped by his height, and he built up this complex that the world was against him. And again, he's only got himself to think about. He spirals round, and he gets himself into a stew and works himself into a hatred. With nobody to bounce this off, nobody to challenge his ideas, he just carries on down until he gets to this dreadful state.
You could argue that this is about kind of how we treat men in society, in terms of men being expected to kind of hold on to their feelings. They don't have maybe the same resources or same encouragement to talk about their feelings, to talk about problems they have. Certainly in the 1970s, you wouldn't have had much support for men who were struggling. So in that sense, with Michael Brown, who's struggling to find a job, he needs a job, he can't get one. He's kind of on his own, obsessing about it, trying to find someone to blame for that. And in that sense, the logical people to blame are the people who work in the job centre, the labour exchange as it then was, who he sees on a regular basis and who he feels aren't doing enough to get him a job.
In October 1974, one afternoon, Michael Brown walked the 300 yards from his flat to the employment exchange at Roebuck House. Underneath his coat, he had concealed a single-barrel 12-bore shotgun.
When he went into the job centre, he caused major panic going on. Imagine mayhem in there, chaos. He was using a sawn-off shotgun, so it's not a refined weapon at all. It's just really random, and would really cause a lot of panic, understandably.
The first victim was a young man called John Lego. He was 25, recently married, and his wife had recently given birth to the couple's first child. He was directly in Brown's line of fire. And Brown shot him at point-blank range with the shotgun. Leaving Lego lying mortally wounded on the floor. At that point, Michael Brown went searching for more victims. And he found his next victim, Sally Yeo.
She was a 27-year-old counter clerk who had been walking on the rear staircase.
And as he had done with John Lego, Brown raised the shotgun and shot her. When her body was finally found, it was seen that she was still clutching the pencil she had been using in her job as a clerk, as if she was still ready to take dictation. After killing Sally Yeo, Michael Brown went up the flight of stairs to the third floor office, and there he found Kenneth Watkins, who was an executive officer, a senior manager if you like.
Kenneth Watkins was in the manager's office on the third floor. He had no warning. It was as if Michael had walked straight in, shot him, and then walked out.
One man who managed to escape with his life that day was employment officer Michael Gurney. This was despite finding himself to be the next person in Michael Brown's gun sight. This is the first time he has ever discussed events of that fateful day.
At about 3:15 that afternoon, I heard a bang. It was a particularly loud bang. So I went and literally opened my office door and stood in the doorway and looked out. My first instinct was, it's a child with a cap gun, a very loud cap gun. And then I realised that it wasn't, it was a rifle. I had a quick look round, saw John lying on the floor, saw this chap, realised he had a gun. He fired a shot in my direction, but it hit the ceiling, and then I still stood there, just wondering what was going on. He fired another shot, which I think hit the floor, by which time I realised it obviously wasn't a place to stand. There were people running all over the place. Two ladies ran towards me. I grabbed hold of both of them, pulled them into my office and shut the door, locked it, left my office then and went out and then went downstairs, banged on the door. They opened it and I just went in there and just said, there's some guy up there with a gun, phoned the police, went out then through the public office and stood outside the office, by which time the police had arrived.
At that point, police had surrounded Roebuck House and were using a loud hailer, telling staff to keep down and to keep themselves safe.
A couple of my colleagues told me subsequently that he had fired in their direction as they were coming out, and then they had shut the door, and they heard him outside the door just saying, I'm sorry, and then he had put the gun in his mouth and blown his head off. The following day, everybody just turned up back at work. And we just carried on as best as we could. The day after was a Friday, and I mean, the only different thing, I suppose, for the day was that you were aware that there were colleagues that weren't there. Ken was a lovely bloke. He was married, had two lovely daughters. I mean, I'd only met John that day. Lovely bloke. Sally was an only child. She was 27. We had to walk past where he had shot himself, and I do recollect the walls and the ceiling were bright red. And the weird thing is, of course, in those days, our cleaners had to clean that up.
When the police went to investigate this, the evidence they found from the shots themselves, where they'd been embedded, the police were able to literally map out the trail that he had taken, the route he had taken as he was shooting. And seeing where the cartridges had been dropped, as they'd obviously been shot and fallen through, he was reloading as he was going. So as he's causing the devastation and mayhem, he's just reloading, is shooting, reloading, shooting, reloading, all the way through the building.
As is so often the case, the big flag that comes up is, what if Michael Brown hadn't been allowed a shotgun licence? And the police, perhaps defensively afterwards, said there was nothing legally to stop Michael Brown owning a shotgun. But what sticks in my mind is that his behaviour, his isolation, his alienation almost from the rest of society, and his anger at that should have been red flags.
I suspect that Brown's kind of sense of failure, the fact that he feels he's not achieving much, he doesn't look the way that he wants to look, all these things have been slowly building up in him. And that you get this sense that he's also quite paranoid, and his feelings of paranoia are being increased by how he interacts with people at the job centre. You know, the feeling that he feels they're not taking him seriously, they're not getting him the job that he wants. He feels other people are kind of before them in the job queue, in a sense. So all these kind of feelings of persecution, of paranoia, of the fact that life isn't treating him as he feels it should treat him, are building up, and then all it takes is one slight thing, one kind of innocent comment, and suddenly this desire for revenge becomes very real and very fully formed in his brain. People in his local community didn't take Michael Brown seriously. They did see him as something of a joke, which he felt very keenly. After the spree killings occurred, you know, they made clear that they would never have seen him as being a murderer, of doing something like that, because he was a joke, because they dismissed him. And it kind of feeds into his fears, you know, this kind of sense of short man syndrome, that he felt ignored or kind of not even seen by people. He wasn't taken seriously. And so this act, this spree killing, is his way of saying, hey, I am here, notice me.
A spree killer is basically somebody who goes out and kills a number of people, usually in one or two sites. It may move within a building with the intention eventually then of committing suicide or being suicide by cops, being shot by the police. They normally kill 3 or more people. There's usually no connection, or very little connection, between the individuals. The individuals tend to be randomly shot. There may be a connection in the sense like a school or university, a church or some religious organisation, but they very rarely go out to kill an individual.
It's like a school shooting where their ills come from that school or from the school teachers there, so that's where they must strike. Equally, he feels that he should have had better employment than he had. He shouldn't have had the difficulties he was having with employment. The job centre, in fact, had quite a large file on his job applications and assistance they'd given to him. So he was being helped, but again, it was a very dysfunctional approach that he had to the job centre, and he wanted to take it out on them. Anyone there would be shot. A young woman is shot dead, age 27, a middle-aged man is shot dead. So there's no particular age group that he's aiming for. He's not looking for the boss. He just wants to shoot anybody associated with the job centre.
With spree killing, it's not actually who you kill that matters, it's the fact that you kill and the fact that you kill multiple people. You don't care who they are. So there's not a sense of him looking for particular individuals and killing them. It's just kill the first person you see. So that's why you see that the victims are, they are job centre workers. So it's very random, and so therefore the victims were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. There's nothing they could have done to kind of minimise their risk of getting killed because they weren't specific targets. I say the location was the target. So anybody in it was fair game as far as Brown was concerned.
I think the job centre, in a sense, has one advantage. It's got open access. Here's a man who's gone and shot 3 or more people, more or less in one go, and basically on the same site. He's expressing his anger. I haven't seen his pathology reports, but I suspect that he was either depressed and maybe self-medicating with alcohol. He might have been taking other drugs. Certainly, I would expect him to have had some health problems, and this would have been identified with the pathologist. But as a spree killer, you find time and time again they're angry with the world, but they're also angry with themselves. They want to commit suicide. We find it time and time again. Most spree killers will eventually kill themselves, but they want to take other people with them. They want to express that anger and show the world why they're killing themselves. They're angry because the world is bad to them, so they will get the revenge on the world. I don't think he had any particular dislikes to any of the victims he shot. I think he just shot randomly, and it was just an unfortunate collateral in that sense. But you find they often use schools, churches, universities, anywhere they've got open access, where there's no security on the door, and they can wander around.
It's difficult to know the motivations, obviously, of a spree killer who then kills themselves, but it's a common thing. And you could say, well, they realise that the enormity of what they've done, there is no option for them because it's either that or go to prison for a very long time. Or it could be that their anger dissipates, they've exacted their revenge, and therefore that pressure that's been building up in them has gone, and they're exhausted, it's done. They've done what they needed to do, and therefore their life is over. The guilt that kind of Michael Brown implies that he's going through with his last words, I'm not sure whether that can be believed or not, because he didn't need to kill those people. There were other ways to kind of deal with his issues. And he was angry enough to just go out and shoot them. And so I think it's more that this avoidance of responsibility. If you kill yourselves, you're not then being made responsible for what you've done. You don't have to face it. And I think that's probably the most obvious reason why he then took his own life.
Spree killers take their lives because that's what the purpose of the whole exercise is. They're angry, they're depressed, they don't see any hope, they're angry with the world. They're going to chop themselves. That's the clear intention. But before they do that, they're going to make the world suffer. And by that, they kill either children or kill people attending religious organisations or students at university. The individuals are of no real importance. It's just the killing that's important. Most of them kill themselves. Sometimes they have gun battles with the police and get killed by the police, or do it in such a way that we get what we call suicide by cops. Very, very rarely do they actually surrender and not get killed or kill themselves.
The totality of what they've done comes in upon them. They can only look forward to particularly long periods of imprisonment. They've made their mark. They're unbalanced. Remember anyway, this is not the actions of a sane individual who would reason things. This is somebody who's lost control, and the balance of their mind is disturbed, rather like a suicide. People commit suicide when the balance of their mind is disturbed. The week before, they may not have committed suicide. The week after that happened, they may not have committed suicide because they may have redressed the issue that was driving them to desperation. Equally, some mass shooters may, had they gone a little bit longer, may have worked through the issues and come out the other side. There are a number of people that have from time to time wanted to show their anger by hitting out at a particular group of people, maybe not by mass murder, but some people have. They work through it. There is an initial instinct to want to do harm because you perceive an ill against you. They work it through and then they rationalise it and they come out at the other end. Michael Brown didn't.
By the very nature of this sort of crime, almost a random mass murder, it's carried out either by someone with a grudge or someone who has an element of mental illness. And that makes it more likely that having committed the murder or the murders, the killer will see no other way out than to take his or her own life. And that's why it's not uncommon for cases like this, when there has been a spree murder, a random series almost of killings in a very short period of time, for the killer to be found dead and at the scene by his own hand. What that also does, apart from cheating justice, if we want to call it like that, because there can never be a trial, it cheats the relatives of the victims of what is the most important piece of information, a definitive explanation of why their loved one was killed.
There are a couple of elements as to why firearms might be used by spree killers. You have this element of fantasy in that you're recreating this image of yourself. You become a powerful person, somebody in control, because you have this really destructive weapon. You can imagine yourself as a cowboy or as some sort of folk hero. Here you are going into battle with your weapon. At the same time, though, it's a quick way to kill people. Shooting is so quick, it doesn't involve kind of even looking at a person. You know, you could just fire randomly and manage to kill people. So in that way, you're not really taking responsibility for your actions. You're not getting close to a victim, looking into their eyes and killing them in some sort of slow or particularly violent way, sort of like, you know, strangling or something like that. Here, you can take pot shots, you can kill people quickly, you can kill multiple people quickly. I do feel that Michael Brown would have benefited from counselling, and in today's society we have far more resources available to people who are struggling for whatever reason. In terms of his lack of height, you can imagine how difficult that would be for a man in a society that's kind of obsessed with appearance, obsessed with people looking a certain way. And so that would be magnified in the 1970s, where there's this kind of macho culture where people don't talk about this sort of thing, or where they might tease or bully someone for being different. And then that person has little recourse that will help him deal with that and come to terms with how he looks. There's an element there of sympathy towards his resentment and the fact that he hadn't got appropriate channels to kind of discuss this and talk through his feelings and understand and come to terms with them. But that still doesn't explain what he went on to do.
It was very plain that the man who had murdered John Lego, Sally Yeo and Kenneth Watkins had committed suicide at the scene. It doesn't tell us why, and it didn't tell the detectives why Michael Brown had carried out this mass murder. What had driven this man to slaughter 3 people who he didn't even know? The police went and they interviewed his neighbours, and his neighbours said he was a quiet, pleasant man. But what they did remember was the sound of his typewriter, and they remembered hearing late at night someone, presumably Brown, they thought, hammering away at an old manual typewriter. And when the police searched that flat, they found what he had been typing. And it was a series, a succession of poems. And in each of these poems, he poured out his resentment and paranoia. The opening to one of them, the opening to one of these poems gives a clue as to what was going on in Brown's head. It starts, prejudice, 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 prejudice. Now, that's a pretty clear indication that what was driving this man was his belief that he was being discriminated against, that he was being singled out for special treatment, to deny him a job because he was so small. It wasn't true, but that's the problem. When that level of paranoia develops and feeds on itself, it becomes almost unstoppable, and that's what happened in Michael Brown's case.
And of course, a number of stories went up that, he was upset because his benefit had been disallowed, or he'd been upset because he tried to get a job but was with the department but was unsuccessful. I don't know what the truth of it was. I think that the chap had a big chip on his shoulder. He had a problem, a mental problem. I don't know what the trigger was myself. I'm sure there were all sorts of triggers. I mean, why would you walk around with a gun and then go in to shoot somebody? I have no idea. Maybe it's his stature. I wouldn't have thought so, but there are people that don't get jobs for a variety of reasons.
Well, people talk about small man conflicts. They talk about Napoleon being a classic example of that. The small man or the small dog that has to take on the bigger dog or take on the world. I'm never quite sure whether it's chicken and egg with that, whether because they're small they feel they're being pressurised, or because they're pressurised by the world that they respond that way. But there are a lot of small people and so many very tall people who cope with life as it is. So I don't think we can use his height as being the main reason. It's his attitude to his height that's the main reason for his behaviour.
A coroner's inquest was held into the shooting, but it reveals startlingly little about Michael Brown or the motivation for his crimes.
The labour exchange did not show any prejudice towards Mr. Brown, and I think that's significant for those that were killed and those that work in the employment agency to see. And in fact, there was a comment by the coroner that the file on Mr. Michael Brown was quite a thick one, which indicates the amount of work that people at the Labour Exchange Job Centre were carrying out on his behalf. And so there is no reason to believe that anybody there did anything other than their duty and were killed by a deranged man.
The fact that 3 of their own had been killed the day before has simply been glossed over.
One of the interesting things nowadays is that spree killers tend to leave a manifesto, they put it on the internet, there's record of what they think and everything else. If you look at the guy that did the murders in Norway at the labour camp for the teenagers, he wrote thousands and thousands of pages of his thinking and his manifesto. I know because I read quite a few of them. And they were very biased in what they were thinking and very rigid. And again, I would have expected some form of a suicide note. But suicide note doesn't have to be, I'm going to kill myself. It could be in the form of his writing, his feelings. We know that Michael Brown wrote poetry, and that could have been his kind of farewell note to the world.
In 1970s England, there wasn't the recognition of mental health issues, of PTSD, of the trauma that can impact people's lives after something like this. And what is absolutely shocking to me is the fact that the day after the murders, people at the job centre were expected to just go back into work and pretend like nothing had happened. And the fact that 2 of their own had been killed the day before, there were these obvious spaces where they should be, where they should have been working. it's glossed over. You know, it's kind of go in, carry on, it's stiff upper lip all the way. And the impact on the people who witnessed these killings must have been absolutely horrific. But as far as I know, they were never given the help or the understanding or the space to deal with that.
Today, the scene of Michael Brown's murders is no longer a job centre, but the building still bears the scars of the massacre, as does the town of Torquay.
The extent of the rampage was evident years later, when the job centre was no longer using the premises and it was being renovated for use elsewhere. There was still shot being found in the wall, in the material of the building, all over the place, several rooms, because his rampage was not confined to one place. He went throughout the building, shooting at will.
This case is tragic because 3 innocent people lost their lives. So it's not only the effect on them, it's the effect on other colleagues, it's the ripple effect on the family and the community. Plus, Torquay is known as the Riviera of the coast. It's a holiday area. It's where genteel people go to retire. So it doesn't do the neighbourhood image much good when you've got a homicidal maniac going around with a gun, as the media and press would describe him. So, you know, it had a ripple effect that would last for quite a time.
One of the things that tourist resorts want to do is to put out that positive image. The last thing they want at them is to be acknowledged that there are social issues. And I think as I was growing up, there was always this feeling that if you had a social problem, it wasn't locals that were responsible for it. It was always incomers. And it was always a certain type of incomers. So I think there was a collective forgetting, and I think that happens in most seaside resorts. That let's move on, let's forget it. The last thing we want is to alarm tourists that there might be a crime issue or a drugs issue. We want to concentrate that image on the seafront. And so in one ways that's quite legitimate. In other ways there can be a sort of a neglect, and let's not seriously tackle issues around poverty.
Today the name Michael Brown and his crime is all but forgotten, and other than the coroner's inquest at the time, no effort has been made to understand why he may have carried them out. How can this be?
I think it's not very well known because it's such a tragedy for us as a people to kind of turn around and think that we may have caused somebody to do this. Mass shootings aren't very prominent in the UK. We're considered quite a tolerant country. So for someone to say, oh, this is because of the way we treat people, I think that hits home quite in a sore spot.
Michael Brown had problems, and it doesn't sound like anybody tried to help him overcome his problems, and it doesn't sound like anybody helped him come to terms with his physical status. The other sad thing is that 3 people died that didn't need to die.
Well, I think it's absolutely shocking that 3 hard-working, decent people have been struck down for no good reason, and that the man who did it killed himself in the end, who was totally wrong in his belief. And it happened here in Torquay, a seaside town, a pleasant town.
We like our crimes to be solved quickly and to understand why they happened, so that we can stop similar events happening in the future. But also because we like kind of neat ends. We want to tie everything up and make sure we understand it and it's all clear why it happened. And in this case, we don't have that kind of clear-cut ending. Yes, we know who killed these people in the job centre, but we still don't know exactly why he did it. He didn't leave, like a suicide note explaining in detail what happened and why he did what he did. And so at the inquest, you get a sense that, okay, if we can't understand it, if we're not going to get these answers, we need just to keep quiet about it and pretend like it's a clear-cut case, because that way other people avoid any responsibility for what happened. You know, there are people who could have stopped it if his concerns had been taken seriously, if somebody had sat down and talked to him properly. Perhaps it might not have happened. If somebody hadn't sold him a shotgun, it wouldn't have happened. So there are still questions nearly 50 years later about how he was allowed to commit this crime and how the chances to avoid it were missed, that still aren't being answered.
4 lives were lost that day in October 1974, including that of Michael Brown. His motives will never be fully understood because they died with him.